They gave her a ruin and called it an inheritance. A burned house at the edge of the mountains, a pile of black timber and cold stone, where nothing was supposed to grow, where no one was supposed to stay. She was 22. She had no money, no family, no one who would come looking if the winter swallowed her whole. The men in town smiled when they handed her the key. They thought they were handing her a grave. And for 3 days, they were almost right. She knelt in the ashes. She did not eat. She did not move. The wind came down off the peaks like a living thing, and it whispered the same word over and over. Quit, quit, quit. Then, on the 4th morning, she saw something small, something purple, a single wildflower pushing up through a crack in a scorched stone. Alive, where nothing had a right to be. She stared at it for a long time, and something in her went cold and quiet and hard. She stood up. She wiped the ash from her hands, and she made a promise the wind could not break. She would not die here. What she did not know, what no one in that valley could have guessed, was that beneath her frozen feet, something had been waiting in the dark, patient, silent, and it was about to save her life. The gate closed behind her with a sound like a door shutting on a tomb. Not loud, not dramatic, just a small, final click of iron meeting iron, and then the long silence that comes after a thing can never be undone. The woman who turned the key did not look at her. She had a tired face and a starched white collar, and she folded her hands in front of her the way people do when they have already decided that something is no longer their concern. "You are of age now," the woman said. Her voice was flat, rehearsed. "The parish can keep you no longer. You understand." The girl on the other side of the gate did not answer. There was nothing to say. She was 22 years old, and in the space of one cold gray morning, she had become something the world has very little use for. A grown orphan. A woman with no one to claim her, and no place that would have her. Her name was Marin, and everything she owned in the world fit inside a single thin paper envelope, held tight against her chest as if it could somehow keep her warm. She had not always been alone in the way she was alone now. There had been a roof once, a narrow iron bed in a long cold room, a row of other children breathing in the dark, the small sounds of them turning in their sleep. It was not love. She had stopped pretending it was love a long time ago. But it was a wall against the wind. And when a person has nothing else, a wall against the wind can feel almost like a home. Now even that was gone. For years she had known this morning was coming. She had watched it happen to the others, one by one, as they came of age. Watched them led to the gate and turned out into a world that did not want them. She had told herself she would be ready. She was not ready. No one ever is. She stood on the cobbled street with the morning fog curling cold around her ankles, and she opened the envelope with stiff, careful fingers. Because when a thing is all you have left, you open it slowly. Inside there were 3 things: a folded paper, heavy and official, with a wax seal pressed into one corner, a single iron key, old, dark with age, the kind of key that fits no lock made in this century, and a small, sad handful of paper bills, barely enough for a few days of bread, barely enough to matter at all. That was it. That was the sum of everything the world had decided to give her. That was what they believed she was worth. She closed her fist around the key, and she felt how cold it was, how heavy, a small dead weight in the center of her palm, and she did not yet know it. But that cold iron key would one day open a door to something no one in the valley below could have dreamed. But that morning, it was only cold. The man who had handed her that envelope was named Vance. He was a man who loved the sound of his own importance. He sat behind a wide, dark desk in a room that smelled of pipe smoke and old paper and self-satisfaction, and when she had stood before him, he had looked at her the way a man looks at a stain on his good sleeve. "There's a piece of property," he had told her, tapping the folded paper with one thick finger. "Up north, in the high country, past where the road gives out and the maps stop bothering." He let the words hang in the air. He was a man who liked to make a person wait. And then a slow smile had crawled across his face. "It belonged to your great-grandmother, a woman by the name of Cora." He said the name the way another man might spit out a curse. "The old folks up that way still talk about her, you know. They say she was touched, wrong in the head." He tapped his own temple and chuckled. "They say she had strange notions, ideas about living with the mountain, working with the cold instead of fighting it like a sensible person, as if the mountain were a thing you could reason with." His chuckle deepened into something uglier. "And they say the mountain gave her its answer, with fire." Marin had stood very still through all of it. She had learned long ago that stillness was a kind of armor. "The house burned," Vance went on, leaning back, lacing his fingers across his belly. "Years and years ago. Burned right down to the foundation, with the old woman still inside it, if the stories are true. And the stories are always true enough, up in that country." He slid the envelope across the polished desk toward her. "There's nothing left of it now but black stone and bad memory. The folks up there have a name for it." He paused, savoring it. "They call it the burned place." Marin looked down at the envelope and did not touch it. "The land's worthless," Vance said. "Won't grow a thing. Won't sell for a single dollar. Nobody'd buy a cursed ruin. But the law is the law, and the law says it passes to you now, the last of that sorry line." He spread his hands as if presenting her with a great kindness. "Consider it a gift." And then he did the cruelest thing of all. He pretended to feel sorry for her. He sighed. He shook his head slowly. He made his voice go soft and pitying, but not for her, never for her. He made it soft for the benefit of the other men in the room, the councilmen, the clerks, the men who sat along the wall and watched, and who would tell this story later over their warm suppers, in their warm houses, and laugh. The poor mad girl, the cursed inheritance, the grave with a key. Marin reached out, at last, and took the envelope from the desk. She did not let them see her hands shake. She did not give them a single tear. She lifted her chin, and she turned, and she walked out of that room with her back straight as a fence post. And only when she was through the door, and into the empty hall where no one could see her, did she let herself lean against the cold wall and breathe, just for a moment, just long enough. Then she straightened and she walked on. There are two ways to break a person. You can break them all at once, a single blow, a sudden loss, one terrible moment that splits a life cleanly into before and after, or you can break them slowly. A gate clicking shut, a starched collar and folded hands, a slow, cruel smile, and a handful of bills that says you are worth less than the dirt on a rich man's boot. And then a long, cold road that leads to a grave they are already laughing about. Maren did not yet know which kind of breaking this would turn out to be. She knew only that there was nowhere left for her to go but north. So north she went. The journey swallowed her by slow degrees. She spent nearly every bill she had on a single seat in the back of a freight wagon. There was no real seat in truth. She wedged herself between wooden crates and bulging grain sacks, and the great wheels groaned and rattled beneath her as the land began, almost without her noticing, to climb. The driver was an old man with a face like cracked leather and eyes the color of a winter sky. He said almost nothing the whole long way. He chewed slowly on something and watched the road and let the silence be. But once, when the wagon stopped to rest the horses at the edge of a gray meadow, he turned in his seat and looked back at her for a long, measuring moment. "You sure about this, miss?" he asked. "Where you're headed?" Maren looked out at the rising hills, at the dark, ragged line of pines, at the gray peaks beyond them, half lost in cloud. "No," she said. It was the most honest word she had spoken in days. The old man studied her a moment longer. Then he nodded, slowly, as if that were exactly the right answer, and turned back to his horses without another word. She thought about that nod for a long time afterward. It was, she would later realize, the first time in longer than she could remember that anyone had looked at her and seen a person. The lowlands fell away behind the wagon, and they did not come back. The gentle, rolling country she had always known, the only country she had ever known, gave way to something harder, sharper. The hills grew teeth. Gray granite shoulders pushed up through the thinning grass, and the pines that clung to them stood twisted and stunted, all of them leaning the same direction, bent forever by a wind that never quite stopped blowing. The air changed too. It grew thin and clean and very cold. It carried the smell of pine sap and wet stone, and beneath all of it, faint but unmistakable, something sharp and metallic, the smell of snow that has not fallen yet, the smell of a winter making up its mind. When the road at last gave out, just ended, the way roads sometimes do at the very edge of the world, the old man brought the wagon to a stop and pointed one gnarled finger up a faint track that wound away into the trees. "Up that way," he said. "Day's walk, maybe two, the shape you're in." He hesitated, and his weathered face tightened. "Folks don't go up there, miss. Haven't in years. There's a reason for that." He did not say what the reason was. Then he clicked his tongue at the horses, and the wagon turned and rattled back down toward the warm and the known and the safe. And Maren stood alone at the foot of the mountain, with her thin coat and her thin envelope, and the great gray silence pressing down on her from the peaks above. She tightened the coat around her shoulders, and she started walking. For 2 days, she climbed. The track was barely a track at all, just a faint memory of where feet had once worn the earth, half swallowed now by brush and root and the patient work of time. She climbed until her legs burned and trembled. She climbed until the thin soles of her shoes, made for swept corridors, not for mountains, wore raw against the stone. And the wind came with her the whole way. It was not a kind companion. It plucked at her coat with cold fingers. It crept down the back of her collar and pressed itself against her skin. It found every gap, every seam, every place where her thin clothing failed her. And in the long, hollow hours of climbing, it began to seem as though the wind were speaking to her, not in words, in something older than words. Go back, it seemed to say, low and endless. Go back, foolish girl. There is nothing for you up here. There was never anything for anyone up here. She did not go back. She did not, in truth, have anywhere to go back to. And so she put one foot in front of the other, and then the other in front of that one. And she climbed up into the very teeth of the wind. Because sometimes the only courage a person has left is the plain, stubborn refusal to lie down. She slept that first night curled in the roots of a great fallen pine, wrapped tight in her coat, the cold of the ground seeping slowly up through her body and settling into her bones. She did not sleep much. She lay there and watched the stars wheel slowly overhead, more stars than she had ever seen in her life, hard and bright and pitiless in the black bowl of the sky. And she felt, beneath them, exactly how small she was. A speck, a breath. A girl that no one in all the wide world would ever miss. By the second evening, she was no longer simply tired. Tired was a country she had left far behind. She was hollow, carved out from the inside, scraped clean, filled with nothing now but the cold and the dull, distant ache of a hope she could no longer quite remember the shape of. And then, just as the last light was bleeding out of the sky, just as the world was turning that deep bruised purple that comes before full dark, she saw it, a shape rising against the dimming sky, a chimney standing alone on the rise ahead of her, black and narrow and tall, pointing up at the first cold stars like a finger raised in warning, or like a tombstone. Maren stopped, and her heart, what was left of it, that small battered thing, lifted just for a moment. A chimney meant a house. There was supposed to be a house. She began to walk faster, the very last of her strength gathering itself and carrying her up the final slope, her breath tearing ragged in the thin, cold air. And then she crested the rise, and she saw what was truly there, and the small, lifting thing inside her chest went out. It was not a house. It was the ghost of one, a black smear against the failing light. A wild scatter of charred timbers flung across the frozen ground, like the bones of some great beast that had fallen here in an ancient battle and never risen again. The stone foundation was a jagged, open wound in the earth, half filled now with old ash and the first thin crust of snow. And the chimney, the thing she had taken for hope, the thing that had quickened her dying steps, stood utterly alone in the middle of the ruin, a single blackened column of stone, the one thing left standing in a place where everything else had burned away to nothing. It was exactly what Vance had promised it would be. It was worse, even. He had called it a grave, and in calling it that, he had been generous. Because a grave is a place where someone is meant to rest. A grave is an ending with at least a little dignity in it. This was no grave. This was a wound that had never been allowed to heal. A place the world had hurt, badly, and then simply turned its back on and forgotten. Maren walked into the ruin slowly, Her worn shoes crunched on charred wood and the broken shards of old pottery. She passed through the shape of what had once, surely, been a doorway, past the shape of what had once been a hearth, a place where a fire had warmed a family on long winter nights, in some far-off time she could not imagine. She knelt down in the center of it all, and she pressed her bare fingers to the cold ground. They came away black with ash, ash that had lain here, undisturbed, longer than she had been alive. This was it. This was her inheritance. This was the gift Vance had given her, with that slow and cruel and well-fed smile. A scar, a ruin, a cold joke with an iron key, and the key was still there, in the pocket of her coat. Heavy, useless. A key to a door that had burned away to ash years before she had ever drawn her first breath. Maren sank all the way down into the cold ash. And finally, after the gate, and the collar, and the smirk, and the long road, and the wind that had whispered at her all the way up the mountain, finally, with no one left to watch her, she let herself break. The despair came over her like something with weight and substance. It settled onto her chest and pressed the breath out of her in slow degrees. It blurred the black ruin in front of her until the burned timbers swam and ran together like ink in water. She did not sob. She was far past sobbing. She wept silently, the way only the truly emptied weep, the tears tracking clean lines down through the soot on her cheeks, and falling into the gray ash without a single sound. She had come so far. She had endured so much, for so long, and it had all led here, to black stone and cold wind, and a chimney pointing up at a sky that did not care whether she lived or died. The dark came down over the mountain, and the cold came down with it, and Maren curled herself into the small sheltered space at the base of that lone chimney, pulled her thin coat tight around her, and let the long night take her down into itself. She did not move far from that spot for 3 days. It is hard to explain, to anyone who has never been hollowed out that way, what those 3 days truly were. It was not a choice. She did not decide to lie there and let the cold come and take her. It was simply that the will to rise had gone out of her, the way a fire goes out, quietly, when there is nothing left anywhere to burn. She ate the last of the hard bread she had carried up the mountain, cold and dry and without any taste at all. She drank from a half-frozen stream that ran nearby, the water so cold it ached deep in her teeth and made her hands go numb. And the rest of the long hours she lay in the shadow of the chimney and watched the pale sun crawl slowly across the gray sky and offer her no warmth whatsoever, a coin of cold white light, and nothing more. The nights were the worst of it. The nights were long, so long, and the cold was a living thing that crept in close, and the wind came down off the high peaks and sang its low and mournful song through the blackened skeleton of the ruined house. A dirge for a life that had ended here in fire and sorrow. And now, perhaps, for the one about to end here in cold and silence. Hope was a country she had lost the road to. And somewhere in those 3 gray days, giving up stopped feeling like surrender. It began to feel like rest. It began to feel, in the longest and emptiest of those hollow hours, like the only kind thing the mountain had ever thought to offer her. But the mountain was not finished with her yet. On the 4th morning, something changed. It did not change all at once. There was no swell of music, No warm, golden light breaking suddenly through the clouds. Real change, the kind that reaches down and saves a life, almost never comes that way. It comes slowly and quietly, the way the dawn comes. Maren lay in the cold ash, watching the pale sun lift itself, inch by inch, over the jagged eastern peaks. And something small caught at the corner of her eye, something low at the base of a foundation stone, just an arm's length from where she lay. Something purple. She blinked. At first, she was certain the cold had finally crept all the way into her mind, that she had begun, at last, to see things that were not there. But it was there, a wildflower, a single, slender, impossible thing, no taller than her smallest finger, growing straight up out of a narrow crack in a scorched and blackened stone. Its stem was thin as a thread. Its petals were a deep and defiant purple, trembling in the cold morning air. It had no business being alive. There was no soil there for it, no shelter from the wind that cut through this dead place like a blade. The fire had taken everything years ago, and the cold should have killed anything foolish enough to try to grow here. And yet, there it was, pushing up through the ash, reaching, with everything it had, toward a sun that gave it nothing at all. Alive, where nothing had any right to be alive. Maren stared at it for a long, long time, and something inside her turned. It was not warmth. It was not hope. Not yet. Those would come later, and they would come slowly, and they would have to be earned. This was something harder, something colder, and in its own way, far stronger. It began as a single clear thought, rising up slow and bright through the gray fog of her despair. That little flower never had a chance either, and it grew anyway. She thought of the gate, clicking shut behind her. She thought of the woman with the starched collar, folding her hands, deciding she was no longer anyone's concern. She thought of Vance, leaning back in his chair, lacing his fingers across his belly, smiling that slow and cruel and patient smile, telling the other men all about the poor mad girl and her cursed inheritance. Already laughing in that warm and well-fed room at a death that had not even happened yet. "You are already dead," his smile had said to her. "You just haven't had the decency to lie down." And lying there in the ash, with the cold in her bones and that one impossible purple flower trembling at her side, Maren felt something deep in her chest go very still, and very cold, and very, very hard. It was anger, but not the hot, blind kind that flares up bright and then burns itself out in a moment, leaving nothing behind. It was the other kind, the quiet kind, the kind that settles down deep into the bones and the marrow and does not leave, the kind that does not shout and does not weep and does not beg, the kind that simply, finally, decides. It was not warmth, that anger, but it was heat. And in a frozen and forsaken place, heat is the beginning of every single thing that follows. Maren sat up, slowly. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest, stiff with cold and with 3 long days of stillness. Every joint felt rusted shut like the old iron key in her pocket. But she sat up, and she looked around her at the ruin, really looked at it for the first time. And she did not see a grave anymore. She saw a problem. Black timbers thrown across the frozen ground. They could be moved, by hand, one at a time, if it came to that. A stone foundation choked with ash and rubble. It could be cleared. A wound in the earth that the world had hurt and then forgotten. And a girl who the world had also hurt and also forgotten. Maybe, she thought, and it was almost the first thought in days that did not taste of ash. Maybe the two of them understood each other. She rose up onto her knees. Then, gripping the cold stone of the lone chimney for support, she pulled herself, trembling, to her feet. The wind hit her at once, hard and cold, plucking at her thin coat, hissing its same old endless song into her ear. Go back. There is nothing for you here. There was never anything. Maren stood there, swaying, and looked out at the gray peaks and the dark pines, and the long road that wound back down to the warm and the known, and the smirking men who were already so certain they knew exactly how her story ended. And she answered the wind, quietly. Not a shout, not a cry of defiance flung at the sky, just a low, steady whisper, a promise made to no one at all but herself, and the wind, and the one small purple flower still trembling there at her feet. No, she said, not here, not like this. And the wind, for the first time in 2 long days, had no answer for her. She wiped the black ash from her raw hands. She wiped the dried tears from her soot-streaked face. She did not know yet how she would survive. She had no plan and no tools but her own 2 hands, no food but what she might somehow find, no friend within 2 days' hard walking, and a winter coming down off the peaks that would not wait 1 single hour for her to be ready for it. She did not know about the cold, patient thing waiting in the dark beneath her feet. She did not know about the heavy iron ring set into a hidden stone, or the worn steps that led down into the dark, or the leather-bound journal that would one day speak to her across all the long years, in the elegant and steady hand of a woman the whole valley had called mad. She did not know that the grave they had handed her was not a grave at all, that it was a gift, a true one, the deepest kind, the kind that hides itself away and waits and shows its worth only to the one with the will and the stubbornness and the quiet, hard anger to dig. She knew none of that. Not yet. She knew only this. She would not die here. She would not give them the satisfaction. And so, as the pale sun climbed higher over the cold and jagged peaks, and the first thin dusting of snow appeared on the highest of them, a white shroud, beginning its slow, patient creep down the mountainside toward her. Maren bent down, and she wrapped her raw hands around the first charred timber, and she began. The work began without a plan. It began the way most real things begin, not with a grand decision, but with a single small motion. A hand closing around a piece of burned wood, a back bending, a breath drawn in the cold. Maren hauled the first charred timber away from the foundation and let it fall onto the frozen ground a few feet off. Then she went back for the second. Then the third. There was no genius in it, no vision, only the simple, stubborn need to make order out of ruin, to push back, even a little, against the chaos the fire had left behind. The wood was heavy. It was wet in some places and crumbling in others, and it left long black streaks across her palms and up the sleeves of her thin coat. Splinters drove deep into the soft skin of her hands, and she pulled them out with her teeth and kept working. Her back began to ache, then to burn. Her muscles soft from a lifetime of swept corridors and folded laundry and quiet, narrow rooms, trembled and screamed and begged her to stop. She did not stop, because something strange was happening there in the cold, with every blackened beam she dragged away. The fog in her head pulled back a little further. That was the thing no one had ever told her. That hard, mindless labor could be a kind of mercy. The frantic, circling noise in her mind, the smirk, the gait, the cold road, the voice that whispered quit. All of it grew quieter with each piece of wood she moved. There was no room for it. There was only the next beam, the next breath, the scrape of charred wood against frozen stone. She was no longer a girl waiting to freeze. She was a force now, small and aching and half-starved, but a force acting upon the world, changing it, making a mark where the world had decided there would be none. She slept that night more soundly than she had in days, and she rose before the pale dawn, and she went back to work. The days began to take on a shape. She would wake stiff and cold in the lee of the chimney, and she would force her aching body up, and she would eat a few mouthfuls of whatever she could find. The last hard crusts, a handful of withered berries from a bush near the stream. And then she would work until the light failed. And slowly, the ruin began to change beneath her hands. The wild scatter of timbers became neat, sorted piles. The choked foundation began to show its true shape, the long lines of old stone, the squared corners, the bones of a house that had once stood proud against this hard sky. Her body changed too. The softness was burning away. Her hands grew rough, then calloused, then hard. Her arms, her shoulders, her back. All of it began to firm into lean, tired strength. She was exhausted, always. But it was a different kind of exhaustion than she had known in the orphanage. That had been the gray, hopeless weariness of a life going nowhere. This was clean. This was the good ache of a body that has spent itself on something that matters. For the first time she could remember, she was tired with a purpose. It was on the second day of that clearing that everything changed. She was working near the base of the lone chimney, levering up a fallen beam, when her worn shoe slipped on a loose pile of rubble. She caught herself against the chimney stones, breathing hard, and then she stopped, because the flagstone beneath her foot had shifted, just slightly, just a fraction. But stone is not supposed to shift. Stone is supposed to be the most certain thing in the world. Marin crouched down. She brushed away the ash and the broken rubble with her bare, calloused hands. And there, set deep into the edge of the flagstone, was a ring. A thick iron ring, rusted brown with age, but solid, whole. The kind of ring a person sets into a stone for one reason only, so that the stone can be lifted. Her heart began to pound, a hard, frantic drumbeat against her ribs, and she did not even know, in that moment, whether it was fear or hope. Perhaps there is no real difference between the two, in a place like that. Perhaps they are the same wild thing, wearing two faces. She wrapped both hands around the cold iron ring, and she pulled. Nothing happened. The stone did not move. It was thick and impossibly heavy, fitted so cleanly into its frame that no light showed at the edges. Marin sat back on her heels, breathing. Then she stood, and she found a length of charred timber, strong oak, mostly spared by the flames. And she wedged the end of it beneath the lip of the stone, and she leaned her whole weight upon it. For a moment, still nothing. And then a groan. A low, grinding groan of stone against stone, a sound that had not been heard in this place for longer than Maren had been alive. The flagstone shifted, lifted, rose at one edge, and from the darkness beneath it came the air. It rolled up over her face, and Maren froze, because it was wrong. It was all wrong. It should have been the stale, foul breath of a sealed and forgotten place, the smell of rot and damp decay and old dead things. But it was not. The air that breathed up out of that darkness was cool and clean and strangely fresh. It smelled of earth and of root vegetables, and beneath all of it, something else, something faint and clean and ancient that she had no name for. It smelled impossibly of life. Maren heaved at the timber until the great stone door stood fully open. Below her, a set of steep stone steps descended into the dark. She hesitated at the top of them. Of course she did. Any sensible person would. A dark hole in the ground, in a ruined and cursed place, at the edge of the wild high country. It was the very kind of thing that fills the human heart with old, deep, animal fear. But Maren had run out of the luxury of fear. She had nothing left to lose, so she fumbled in her pocket for the small box of matches she had guarded more carefully than anything else she owned, and she began slowly to descend. The first match sputtered, flared, and died in the cool, rising air. She struck the second. It caught. It held. And in its small, fragile, trembling light, the breath caught hard in her throat. The cellar was not empty. It was not a tomb. It was not a grave. It was not a hole in the ground. It was a sanctuary. Along one entire wall, sturdy wooden shelves rose from the packed earth floor all the way up to the timbered ceiling, and those shelves were laden. Jars, hundreds of them, glass jars of every size, sealed tight with wax, gleaming softly in the matchlight, and inside them, color. Color in a world that had been nothing but gray and black and white for days. Preserved peaches, glowing like trapped sunlight, green beans and pickled beets, and tomatoes red as a heart, jams, jellies, a whole congregation of them, their colors only a little muted by the years, standing in their patient rows like a jeweled tapestry of some long-dead summer. Maren moved deeper into the cellar, the match trembling in her hand. Against the far wall stood wooden bins, and in them, mounded high, were potatoes and carrots and onions. Their skins had gone dry and papery with time, but when she pressed one, the flesh beneath was still firm, still good. Sacks of dried beans, sacks of flour, a neat, soldierly row of them, and hanging from the rafters overhead, wrapped in cheesecloth and perfectly kept in that cool, dry, breathing air, cured hams, sides of smoked meat. It should not have kept. By every rule she knew, all of it should long ago have spoiled and rotted and crumbled away to nothing. But the cool, dry, breathing air of that strange place had held it the way the deep earth seemed to hold everything here, patiently, and far, far longer than ought to have been possible. It was a treasure hoard. It was a dragon's gold of pure sustenance. It was food enough. Maren understood it slowly as the second match burned down toward her fingers. Food enough to last a person through a winter, through a long one, through the longest and cruelest of winters. It was not just food. It was time. It was the one thing she had not dared to even dream of. It was a chance. She lit a third match, and its light fell upon something tucked beneath the very bottom shelf. A small metal box. A footlocker, dark with age. It was not locked, with fingers that shook, and not from the cold now. Maren knelt and lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a faded bed of dried lavender that still, faintly, gave off its sweet ghost of a scent, was a single book, a journal, bound in worn leather, soft with handling. She lifted it out as gently as if it were a living thing, and by the light of that third small match, she opened it to the first page. The handwriting was beautiful, elegant and precise, and yet somehow strong, as though the strength of the hand that wrote it had flowed straight down through the ink and into the page itself. At the top of that first page, written like a title, were these words, "The Almanac of this house, and a record of its secrets, for whoever has the wit to find them." Maren sank down onto the cold stone steps, and in the small, flickering, fragile light, she began to read. It was not a diary. That was the first thing she understood. There were no entries about feelings, no record of daily sorrows or small joys. The woman who had written this book, the great-grandmother named Cora, the woman the whole valley had called mad, had not been writing about herself at all. She had been writing about the land. It was a treatise, a manual, a patient, careful study of how to live, truly live, in this hard and beautiful high country. There were pages on the patterns of the wind. On the way, it moved across the valley in different seasons, and what those movements warned of. There were pages on the soil, on the composition of the clay, the depth of the frost, the slow, secret language of the seasons. There were diagrams, elegant, precise drawings, with neat figures and careful measurements written in that same strong, beautiful hand. This was not the work of a mad woman. This was the work of a mind, a brilliant, patient, deeply observant mind, the kind of mind the world so often calls mad, simply because it sees what others are too loud and too hurried and too certain to ever notice. And then Maren turned a page and found the chapter on the cellar. "This is not a hole in the ground," the journal read. "It is the heart of the house. It is the lung. And it is the battery." Maren read on, and her wonder grew with every single line. Cora had not simply dug a root cellar to keep her vegetables through the winter. She had built a machine with no moving parts, a machine that ran on nothing but the patience of the earth itself. The cellar had been dug far deeper than any ordinary cellar, down and down, well below the line where the winter frost could reach, into a rare and dense pocket of heat-holding clay, and from the cellar, 2 narrow shafts ran up to the surface. Maren had seen them. She had taken them for simple vents, for chimneys, for nothing at all. One opened near the base of the great chimney stack. The other, the journal said, opened 100 yards away, higher up the hill. The diagrams explained the rest. And the principle was so simple and so beautiful that Maren had to read it 3 times before she truly understood it. In the warm months, the system drew the summer heat down into the deep clay. The earth soaked it up and held it and stored it, the way a battery holds a charge. The warmth of 1,000 summer days, gathered and kept and saved against the cold to come. And in the winter, the whole thing reversed. The frigid surface air was drawn down into the depths, and there in the dark, the stored warmth of all those summers, the long memory of the sun, gently warmed it before it rose again, soft and mild, up through a clever grate in the floor, and out into the house through the hearth. It was not magic. It was genius. It was a quiet, patient genius that had waited here in the dark for years and years. For someone with the wit and the need and the desperation to finally listen. And it was untouched. That was the thing that made Marin's breath catch all over again there on the cold steps. The fire that had taken the house above had sealed the floor grate shut. It had ended a life. It had left nothing on the surface but black ruin. But the cellar, this fortress of deep stone and patient earth, the fire had never reached. The food had kept. The heart had gone on quietly beating, alone in the dark all these years. Waiting, Marin turned to the last page she had strength to read that night, and there, in that strong and beautiful hand, were these words: "The world will always praise the shout. It will praise the fire that consumes, and the force that breaks, and the loud men who mistake noise for strength. But the earth keeps a longer memory. It holds the warmth of 1,000 summers in its quiet heart. So listen to the earth, not the shout. Its strength is in its silence and its patience, and it will keep you, if only you have the wit to keep faith with it." Marin closed the journal. She sat there a long while in the dark, the dead match cold between her fingers. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not feel entirely alone. She had never met this woman. Cora had died long before Marin was ever born. And yet, reading those words, Marin felt as though a hand had reached out across all the long years and taken hold of hers, gently in the dark. Not alone, she thought. And then, more fiercely, the last of this line. And this line was never mad. It was only ever wise. The discovery changed everything. Not just because of the food, though the food alone meant survival. It changed everything because the journal was not just a larder. It was a blueprint. And out of that blueprint, a plan began to form in Marin's mind. An audacious plan. A mad one, even. Or so the loud world would surely call it. She would not rebuild the farmhouse. Not now. Not with the winter already creeping down the peaks, and only her own 2 hands to do the work. She would do something stranger and bolder and far wiser. She would live in the cellar. She would move down into the very heart of the old house, and she would let that ancient, patient heart keep her alive through the dark months to come. The first task was to wake the machine. She found the floor grate just where Cora's diagram had promised it would be, near the foundation of the chimney. It was choked with rubble, and worse, fused half shut with metal that had melted in the heat of the long-ago fire. Clearing it was brutal work. She found a length of sharpened iron in the ruin, and for 2 full days she chipped and pried and scraped at the ruined grate, her hands raw, her arms shaking with the effort. And then, at last, the final clod of melted metal came free, and Marin felt it. A change in the air, subtle, almost too faint to notice, but real. A slow, cool current rising up out of the darkness below. Gentle as a breath, the lung was breathing again. After all these years, The heart of the house had taken its first deep breath, and Marin sat down right there on the cold floor and pressed her face into her raw and bleeding hands, and she did not weep from grief. For the first time in her life, she wept from something else. After that, she set about making the cellar a home. She hauled down the soundest planks she could salvage from the ruin above, and she laid a level floor over the packed earth. She built a small, rough table and a stool to sit at it. She gathered old burlap and packed it tight around the stone entryway, and she fashioned a heavy, layered door, a barrier of planks and packed earth that could seal the cold and the dark and the wild night out completely. The work became an obsession, a race, because every day now the sun grew weaker, the wind grew sharper, and one cold morning she woke to find the first true dusting of snow on the peaks above her, a white shroud creeping a little lower down the mountain than it had the day before. The winter was coming, and Marin meant to be ready for it. But the mountain does not give its gifts easily. It tests those it might choose to keep. The first test came on a black, moonless night, not long after she had finished the cellar door. She woke to a sound, a low sound, a circling sound, the soft, deliberate crunch of paws on frozen ground just outside her sealed door. And then, rising into the dark, a long and hungry howl. Wolves. Marin lay very still in the dark, her heart slamming. She could hear them moving up above, pacing, testing the air, drawn, perhaps, by the scent of the cured meat hanging in her cellar, or simply by the strange new presence of warmth and life in a place that had been dead for years. She did not panic. She remembered instead a page of Cora's journal, a passage on the creatures of the high country, how they feared fire and feared light, and feared above all the steady, unafraid presence of something that would not run. Do not run from the wild, the journal had said. Run, and you become prey. Stand, and you remain a person. So Marin did not run. She lit her lamp. She took up a stout length of timber, and she stood just inside her heavy door, and she let them hear her there, steady and present and unafraid. And after a long while, the howling moved off. The paws retreated. The night went quiet. And in the morning, when she dared to open her door, there was nothing outside but their tracks in the thin snow, circling, circling, and then turning away, back into the trees she had held. The second test was quieter, and in its own way, worse. It came a week or so later, when she went to take stock of her stores and found that a whole shelf of jars had gone wrong. Some had cracked in the deepening cold. Others had clouded, their seals broken, their contents turned and spoiled, a good portion of her precious food ruined. For one terrible moment, the old despair reached up for her again. She felt it close around her throat. You will not make it. You were a fool to try. The loud men were right, but she did not let it take her. And this time, this was the thing she would remember, long after. She did not reach for the journal. She had lived in this cold long enough now to read it for herself. She knelt by the ruined shelf, and she looked, and she thought, and slowly she saw it. The jars that had failed were all the ones nearest the outer wall, where the stone went cold against the frozen earth beyond. The ones nearer the breathing heart of the cellar, near the warm grate, had held perfectly. The cold was creeping in along the edges, the way the frost crept along everything in this country, patient and quiet, and it was killing the jars from the rim inward. So she moved them, every vulnerable jar, on her own reckoning, down and inward, toward the warmth. She wrapped and sorted and saved, working through the long night by the steady gold of her lamp. And only afterward, only when the work was done, and dawn was bleeding pale through the cracks of her door, did she open the journal at all. And there it was, a whole page on the keeping of food, on which stores must be moved deep away from the cold edge of the cellar, and why. The very thing she had just worked out for herself, written in that strong old hand, years before she was born. She read it, and she smiled, not because the journal had saved her, but because, this time, she had not needed it to. The mountain does not forgive carelessness, Cora had written at the bottom of that page, but it rewards attention. Pay attention, and it will keep you. This is the whole of the law. Marin closed the book. She was learning to pay attention. The third test was the cruelest, because it came from inside her own body. She had cut her hand badly, prying at a stubborn stone in the second ventilation shaft. She had washed it and bound it as best she could, and thought no more of it. But in the night, the fever came. It came in waves, hot and then cold, and her cut hand throbbed and swelled, and the small cellar swam and tilted around her in the lamplight. And she was alone, so utterly alone. No one within 2 days' walk, no one to bring her water, or cool her brow, or sit with her through the long dark hours. If the fever won, no one would even know. But here, too, the journal had not abandoned her. Marin, in her clearer moments, dragged herself to the shelves and found what Cora had written about the healing plants of the high country. The roots and barks and dried herbs that Cora had so carefully stored in a small box near the lavender. She found the one for fever, the one for wounds. She made what Cora's careful instructions told her to make, and she drank it down, bitter as it was, and she lay back in the dark, and she waited. And she was not, in the end, entirely alone. Because every time the fever rose, and the fear came with it, she would reach out and lay her good hand on the worn leather of the journal, there on the table beside her, and it steadied her. A woman she had never met, a hand reaching across the years. Hold on, it seemed to say. Others held on before you, through worse than this. So can you. You are of this line, and this line does not lie down. On the third day, the fever broke. Marin woke clear-eyed and weak and ravenously hungry and alive. And when she sat up and looked around at her small warm cellar, at the colored jars glowing softly on their shelves, at the journal on the table, and the gentle warmth breathing up through the grate, she understood fully for the first time that this place was not killing her, it was keeping her. It was a few days after the fever that she had her first visitor. She heard the wagon before she saw it, the rattle and creak of it laboring up the rough track. She climbed out of her cellar, blinking in the pale daylight, and shaded her eyes. A horse, a wagon, and on the seat, an old man. He was perhaps 60, with a face as weathered and hard as the mountain stone, and eyes that had plainly seen too many hard winters to hold any illusions about anything. His name, she would learn, was Amos Hartley. He kept the only store for a great many miles, down in the settlement, and word had reached him, by way of a certain old freight driver, that a young woman had been set down at the burned place and never come back. He had come, he would admit much later, expecting to find a body. Instead, he found Marin, her face smudged with soot, her bandaged hands raw, methodically packing earth around the entrance to a cellar in the middle of a burned ruin. He sat on his wagon and looked at her for a long, long moment, and his weathered face filled up with something that was half pity and half plain disbelief. "Girl," he said at last, his voice a low rumble, "what in the world do you think you're doing?" Marin wiped her brow with the back of one bandaged hand. "Staying," she said. The old man shook his head slowly. "You can't win her up here. Not like this. Not in a hole in the ground. That chimney'll pull the heat right out of any fire you build. And the wind'll strip this place down to bare rock." He looked at the ruin around her, and his voice softened, almost against his will. "This place is a grave, child. Don't make it yours." Marin looked at him steadily. "The chimney isn't for a fire," she said quietly. "It's for air." The old man blinked. He plainly had no idea what she meant. He saw, she knew, exactly what the whole valley would see. A desperate, half-mad girl, clinging to some nonsensical idea, digging her own tomb with her own raw hands. But he also saw something else. He saw the steadiness in her eyes. He saw the work she had done, the cleared foundation, the sorted timber, the careful, deliberate craft of the cellar door. And whatever he had come up the mountain expecting to find, it was not this. He did not understand her, but he could not quite dismiss her either. He grunted and shook his head one more time and turned his wagon around. But before he went, he paused. "There's hard weather coming," he said, not looking at her. "Worse than usual, the old signs say. You'd do well to come down off this mountain while you still can." "Thank you, Mr. Hartley," Marin said. "But no, not this time." He grunted again and rattled off down the mountain. He came back, though. That was the thing about Amos Hartley. He came back. A week later, the wagon labored up the track again, and this time he said nothing at all about her madness or her grave or coming down the mountain. He simply climbed down and lifted a small wooden crate from the back of the wagon and set it on the ground at her feet. Inside it was a new shovel head, a sturdy lantern, and 2 tins of oil, and a thick, heavy, blessedly warm woolen blanket. "Store credit," he said gruffly, looking everywhere but at her face. "Your great-grandmother had an account with the store, way back. Never settled up before she... Well, consider this what's owed." Marin looked down at the crate, then up at the old man. She knew it was a lie. There was no account. There could not be. It was an act of quiet, reluctant, almost embarrassed kindness. A gruff old man's way of hedging against his own grim certainty that she would die up here. He still thought she was mad, but he was giving her a tool for her madness, a bit of warmth for her grave, and to a girl who had been given nothing but a cold key and a cruel joke, it was worth more than gold. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "Truly." Amos just grunted and climbed back onto his wagon and rattled away down the mountain without another word. But it was a crack. The first crack in the great cold wall of her isolation. It was not, she understood, that he believed in her plan. He did not. He thought it pure foolishness. But he believed in her effort, and somehow that was even more precious. The other visitor came a few days after that, and he had not come to bring her anything at all. She heard the horse first, a fine one by the sound of it, far too fine for that rough country. And when she looked up, there he was, silhouetted against the gray sky. Vance. He sat astride a sleek, well-groomed animal that looked as out of place against that stark landscape as a velvet chair in a barn. He did not dismount. He simply looked down at her from his high perch, with an expression of open, comfortable contempt. "Well, well," he said. His voice carried that same slick, false sympathy she remembered from the room with the wide desk. "Still here, are we? A surprise, that. Most would have come crawling back down to civilization by now, begging for the charity they once spat on." Maren did not answer. She bent back to her work, fitting a final stone into the low wall she had built to turn the snowmelt away from her cellar door. Her silence seemed to needle him far more than any argument could have. "What is all this?" he pressed, gesturing with disdain at her careful work. "What are you doing, girl? Planning to live underground with the moles?" Still, she said nothing, and something in her stillness cracked the smooth surface of his cruelty and let out what lay beneath it. "You're a fool," Vance said. And now the false sympathy was gone, and his voice had gone low and ugly and almost trembling with an old anger. Just like she was. Maren went still. "You know how she died, your precious great-grandmother?" he went on. "In that fire, chasing the same madness you're chasing now. Some lunatic notion about living with the mountain, befriending the cold, as if the cold were a thing that could be befriended." He leaned down from his saddle, and the knuckles whitened on his reins, and the old grievance came pouring out of him. The story of a proud man, his own father, who had tried once to deal honestly with that woman, to bring her worthless ground into proper and sensible use, and had been humiliated for his trouble in front of the whole valley. "She made a laughing stock of a good man," he spat, "with her riddles and her airs and her endless talk of the wisdom of the earth. So that was it. That was the root of all the cruelty, all the contempt, the smirk and the cursed inheritance in the long cold road. An old wound, an old humiliation, passed down from father to son, like a poisoned heirloom." He did not hate Maren at all, she understood. He hated Cora. He had always hated Cora. And Maren was simply the last of that line. The last place left for an old man's old shame to land. "This land wants strength," Vance went on. "Brute strength. Big fires, thick walls, a strong hand. Not this madness in a hole. The first real snow will bury you, girl. You'll freeze in that pit, and no one will find what's left of you until the spring thaw turns the ground." He gathered his reins. "Mark my words," he said. "You are already dead. You simply haven't had the decency to lie down." And he turned his fine horse and rode away, leaving his cruelty hanging in the cold air behind him like smoke. Maren stood in the ruin and watched him go, and she found, to her own quiet surprise, that his words had not broken her at all. They had done the opposite. They had taken the cold, hard anger in her chest, the heat that had first kindled beside that one purple flower, and they had forged it into something even harder, something that would not bend and would not break and would not ever, ever lie down, because she understood now what his world truly was. It was a shout, all of it. The big fires, the thick walls, the brute strength, the certainty, the contempt. It was a loud, frightened shout flung at a mountain that had been there 1,000 years before he was born, and would be there 1,000 years after the last memory of him was scoured from the earth. And her great-grandmother's knowledge was a whisper, a quiet, patient, ancient whisper, the whisper of the earth that remembers every summer, the whisper that breathed warm even now, gently, up through the grate at her feet. Maren turned and looked at the white shroud of snow, lower on the peaks than it had been that morning, creeping down, coming closer. The winter was almost here, and the loud men in the warm valley below were so very certain they already knew how her story would end. She let a small, hard, private smile touch her lips. Then she bent down and went back to her work. She would trust the whisper. She would let them keep their shout. And when the long dark came down off the peaks at last, they would all of them see, every one, exactly whose wisdom the mountain meant to keep. The wind stopped. That was the first sign. And it was the strangest of them all. For so long, the wind had been Maren's only companion. It had moaned through the bones of the ruin. It had hissed at the edges of her cellar door. It had sung its low and endless song across the high peaks, day and night, until she no longer truly heard it. The way a person stops hearing the ticking of a clock in a quiet room. And then, one gray afternoon, it simply stopped. Maren had climbed up out of her cellar to draw water before the dark came down, and she froze halfway, one foot on the worn stone step, and she listened. There was nothing, no moan, no hiss, no song, only a silence so vast and so complete that it pressed against her ears like deep water. A silence that did not feel empty at all. A silence that felt full, held, like a great room gone still in the half-second before something terrible is finally spoken aloud. Slowly, she lifted her eyes to the sky, and what she saw there made the small hairs rise along the back of her neck and her arms. The sky had turned a color she had no name for. A strange, sick, bruised yellow-gray. A color that seemed to swallow the light rather than carry it, so that the whole white and black world below took on a flat, shadowless, waiting look. The pines did not move. The snow on the far peaks did not glitter. Everything had gone still, and dull, and breathless. The air itself had weight now. She could feel it on her skin, against her face. A thickness, a pressure, as though the sky had come down low and heavy over the mountain and was leaning its whole cold body against it. Something deep and old and animal stirred in her chest and began to tremble. And then she remembered. She had read of this in the journal. Cora had written of it, had even given it a name in that strong and beautiful hand that Maren had come to know almost better than her own. The Great Stillness, Cora had called it, when the wind dies all at once, when the sky turns the color of an old wound, when the whole world holds its breath and goes silent as a grave. Do not be fooled by the quiet. It is not peace. It is the deep breath the mountain draws before it speaks. And when the mountain chooses to speak in the deep of winter, it speaks in white. And it does not stop speaking, child, for a long, long time. Be ready before it begins. For once it begins, there will be no time left for readiness. Maren did not waste another moment staring at that terrible waiting sky. She drew her water, and she turned, and she went down into the warm dark, and she made herself ready. She moved through her preparations with a calm that surprised even her. There was no panic in her now. The panic, she understood, belonged to those who were caught unawares. And she was not unaware. She had been warned across all the long years by a woman who had stood in this very place, beneath this very sky, and seen this very thing, and had written it down carefully so that someone, someday, might be saved by the knowing of it. So, Maren did not panic. She worked. She secured the heavy storm door, that thick barrier of layered planks and packed earth she had labored over for so many days, fitting it tight into its frame and barring it fast from the inside. She took stock of her stores one last time. The jars in their patient gleaming rows. The cured meat hanging safe in the rafters. The water she had drawn and set by in covered crocks. Enough. More than enough. Enough to outlast whatever was coming, however long it chose to stay. She trimmed the wick of the good lantern Amos Hartley had given her, and she filled its belly full with oil, and she set it where its steady golden light could reach into every corner of her small world. And then, last of all, she knelt down by the grate set into the floor, and she laid her bare palm flat against the cold iron of it, and she felt it, a current of air rising up out of the deep earth beneath her, slow, steady, patient, and even now, even after all the times she had felt it, she could scarcely believe it. Warm, warmer than the bitter air outside, warm with the stored-up memory of summers she had never seen, gathered down into the deep clay long ago by the hands of a woman she had never met. The heart was beating, the lung was breathing, and whatever was about to come down off those peaks, Maren and her sanctuary would meet it together. She settled herself at her small table beneath the steady gold of the lamp, and she drew the journal onto her knees, and she waited. She was as ready as any living soul could be. The whisper of the earth was on her side. The storm broke just after dark, and it did not come gently. It did not begin with the soft, feathered, drifting snow of gentler places. It came the way the oldest tales swear the wild things come. All at once, and with a fury that seemed almost alive, almost aware, almost personal. The wind returned, but it was not the mournful companion she had known these long weeks. It came back utterly transformed, a shrieking, howling, demon-throated roar that fell upon the mountain like an army storming a wall. It hammered at her storm door. Not a wind any longer, but a fist, a battering, physical, living force, throwing itself against her sanctuary again and again, as though it were determined to tear the door from its frame, to rip her small haven up out of the earth by the roots and fling it screaming into the dark. The snow came riding the wind, driven sideways, hard as flung sand, hissing and rattling against the stone. And beyond her sheltered doorway, the world simply ceased to be. There was no up, no down, no shape, no edge, no distance. There was only the churning, screaming, white vortex where the mountain had been. Only the roar, only the chaos, and down in her cellar, inside the small, steady golden circle of her lamp, Maren sat and listened to all of it, and she was not afraid. Far below her, down in the valley where the warm and the familiar and the certain had always lived, the people heard the storm come too. They hunkered down inside their houses, and they put their faith in the things they had always put their faith in: thick walls, big fires, strong hands, the good, solid, sensible things that the loud world had always believed would keep a person safe. They built their fires high and higher. They fed their stoves and banked their hearths. And they told one another, through the long first hours, that they were safe behind their good stout walls. And at first, they were. At first, in the largest and finest of all those houses, the man named Vance sat before a brand new iron stove, a glass of something warm in his hand, and he believed himself the safest man in all the world. His stove was a modern marvel, an expensive one. To him, it was more than a stove. It was a symbol of everything he believed about the world. That strength was a thing a man could purchase. That cold was a thing a man could simply overpower, if only he threw enough force and fire and money against it. It roared now, that fine stove. It devoured its split logs and threw out a fierce, dry, powerful heat that filled the room. And Vance smiled into his glass, and he stretched his feet toward the warmth, and he spared a single comfortable thought for the foolish girl up on the mountain. He pictured her freezing. He pictured her terrified, scrabbling with broken nails at the walls of her ridiculous pit as the snow poured in on top of her, as the cold took her by slow and merciless inches. It serves her right, he thought, settling deeper into his fine chair, for her defiance, for her madness, for being the last living scrap of that proud, wretched, humiliating line. His stove devoured another log and roared for more, and out beyond the walls of his fine warm house, the patient cold went quietly, steadily on about its work. The first night of the storm wore on, and as the hours dragged by, its true and terrible size began, slowly, to reveal itself. This was no ordinary winter storm. This was the kind of storm the old people of that high country spoke of only in low voices, around their own fires, in the deep of other winters. The kind that comes but once in a long lifetime. The kind that the legends and the cautionary tales were all built upon. A vast and patient and merciless thing, woven of wind and white and an ancient cold that did not care in the slightest what any small and mortal person had built or bought or believed himself to be. And it found every weakness. That was the cruelest patience of it. It found every gap in every wall, every window that had been hung a hair's breadth crooked, every place where some long ago builder had cut a corner, or hurried a joint, or simply trusted that the winter would, in the end, be merciful. The winter was not merciful. The cold crept in through the floorboards. It snaked around the door frames. It came in 100 small, insidious, searching fingers that no roaring fire, however high, could ever quite drive back out again. And down in the valley, the great wood piles, the ones that had seemed so endless, so unquestionable, when the sky was clear, began, hour by frightening hour, to shrink. In Vance's fine house, the long night turned slowly from comfortable to uneasy, to something far worse than either. His stove was a glutton. It had been built for fierce and fast and powerful heat. And powerful heat, he was learning, is a starving thing. By the deep middle of that first night, he had already burned through what should by rights have lasted him a full day. And still the cold came in. Still those 100 small frozen fingers reached through his good stout walls and laid themselves against his skin. The heat poured up out of his stove and straight up his chimney, out into the screaming dark. And the cold simply walked back in through every crack and seam to take its place. Calm as you please. He stuffed rags into the gaps around the windows. It did nothing at all. He piled more wood into the stove than was wise. It devoured the lot and roared and somehow gave back less true warmth than it should have. And still the floor stayed cold as a tomb beneath his stockinged feet. His comfortable smile was long gone now, and his lifelong certainty was curdling slowly, hour by hour, into something cold and tight and sour in the pit of his belly. The storm was not behaving the way it was supposed to behave. His modern, expensive, sensible solutions were failing him one after another. The brute strength he had worshipped every day of his life was being met by a far greater strength. A quiet, ancient, indifferent power that did not roar and did not boast and did not stop. And his strength was losing to it, badly. And high above him, in her small cellar on the mountain, Maren was warm. The roar of the storm reached her only as a distant, muffled thunder, the sound of some enormous battle being fought very far away by armies that could not touch her, in a war that was not hers. The air inside her sanctuary was still and calm and gently, evenly warm. It was not the fierce, dry, devouring heat of a stove. It was something softer than that. Something kinder, something that rose up out of the very earth around her and wrapped itself about her shoulders like a held breath. The radiant, patient, generous warmth of all those stored summers, breathing itself out at last, in the very hour it was needed most. The lamp glowed gold against the old stone walls. The jars glowed on their shelves, a whole silent congregation of color and plenty, keeping her company in the dark. Maren heated herself a simple supper on the little spirit stove Amos had pressed upon her, preserved beans, a few cuts of the smoked meat, and the warm, good, homely smell of it rose and filled her small space until it smelled, for the very first time, like a place where someone truly lived, a place where someone belonged. She ate slowly, she savored it, and then she drew her stool close to the table beneath the steady golden light, and she opened the journal across her knees, and she read. The words were no longer only instructions to her now. Somewhere in those long weeks, they had become a conversation. A conversation carried on across all the long and silent years, between the woman who had built this sanctuary with her own clever hands and the woman who had at last come to fill it with warmth and breath and life again. Maren turned to a passage she had read a dozen times before, and she read it once more. And this time, in the deep heart of the storm, it landed in her chest like a warm hand laid gently over a frightened heart. The world will shout, Cora had written. It will always praise the fire that consumes and the force that breaks. and the loud and frightened men who mistake their own noise for strength. But the earth keeps a far longer memory than they do. It holds the warmth of 1,000 summer suns down in its quiet heart. So listen to the earth, child, not to the shout. The earth's strength is in its silence. Its power is in its patience, and it will keep you warm through the very worst that the mountain can ever say, if only you have the wit and the faith to keep faith with it in return. Maren closed her eyes for a moment, and she listened to the distant, muffled roar of the storm far above, and to the soft, steady, faithful breathing of the warm grate at her feet. And she understood, fully and finally, at last, what her great-grandmother had spent a whole life trying to say. She was not surviving. She was not merely clinging to life in a hole in the frozen ground, the way the loud men down in the valley so surely believed she was. She was thriving. She was warm. She was safe. She was fed and dry and surrounded by plenty. A small, quiet, golden island of summer, in the very dead center of a winter that was, even now, breaking the proud and the certain to pieces in the valley below. She was the last living daughter of a line the whole world had called mad. And the whole world, it turned out, had been so very, very wrong. The storm raged for 3 days, and for 3 long nights. It did not relent. It did not pause to catch its breath. It simply went on, and on, and on, a vast white fury, burying the mountain and the valley and the whole of the known world beneath its weight. And then, on the morning of the 4th day, it stopped. As suddenly as it had begun, the great voice of the storm fell silent. The wind exhausted itself all at once. The snow ceased to fall, and a new world was slowly revealed beneath a sky that had been scrubbed pale and clean and merciless, and a blue so bright it hurt to look upon. It was a world transformed, a world buried, a world gone utterly, perfectly, breathlessly silent. The mountain and the valley had become a single vast white ocean, smooth and unbroken and gleaming, with only the tallest of the trees and the sharpest peaks of the steepest roofs piercing up through the surface here and there, like the masts of great ships that had drowned in the night. Down in the valley, the people crept out of their houses into that terrible, ringing silence, and they looked upon the price the storm had asked of them. It had been a hard reckoning. Roofs had buckled and fallen in beneath the smothering weight of the snow. Wood piles lay scraped down to the bare frozen earth. The whole settlement sat buried and shivering and humbled in a way that not even the oldest among them could remember being humbled before. And the fine, proud house of the man named Vance had become a ruin of its own particular kind. A whole section of his roof had given way beneath the snow, somewhere in the screaming dark of the second night. The cold had walked in through the broken place and made itself thoroughly at home. His fine furnishings were soaked and ruined. His expensive, modern, sensible stove stood cold and dead at last, having devoured every last stick of wood the man owned, and lost its long fight anyway. He had survived, but something inside him had not. The thing he had believed his whole life long, that strength is loud, that cold can be beaten by force, that the brute and the certain always win in the end. That thing had cracked somewhere in the long, cold dark of those 3 nights. And he knew, somehow, even now, that it would never quite be made whole again. He sat in the wreckage of his fine house, in the pale and merciless light of that fourth morning, and he stared at his cold, dead, useless stove. And for the first time in his entire life, he did not know what he believed. It was Amos Hartley who first thought of the girl. He had weathered the storm better than most. An old man who had seen hard winters before, and who knew, deep in his bones, never to trust the quiet ones or the loud ones either. His own small place had held against it. But all through those 3 roaring nights, a single thought had gnawed at him without mercy. The girl, up on the mountain, alone, in her hole in the ground. He had given her a shovel and a blanket and a few tins of lamp oil, and he had told himself, riding back down the mountain that day, that it had been a kindness. But lying awake in the dark with the storm shrieking against his own walls, the memory of it had begun to feel like something else entirely. It had begun to feel as though he had handed a desperate child the very tools to dig her own grave, and then turned his back and ridden away, and done nothing more. So when the snow at last stopped falling, and the first rough paths could be broken through the drifts, Amos Hartley gathered together a small party of the hardiest men he could find, and they made ready to go up the mountain. The stated reason was to check on the remote places, to learn who had lived through the storm and who had not. But Amos knew his own true reason, and it sat heavy and cold in his chest. He was going up to the burned place, to bring down the frozen body of a foolish, stubborn, impossibly brave young woman. And the weight of that knowing settled on his old shoulders like a millstone. The man named Vance insisted on joining them. Amos had not wanted him along, but Vance's own house was a sodden, broken wreck, and he could not bear to sit alone in the ruin of it. And some hard, ugly, grieving thing inside him, though he would have struck any man who dared to name it grief, needed to go up and see for himself. Needed to see that he had been right all along, that the mad girl had frozen in her foolish hole, exactly as he had promised her she would, that the loud and certain world he had built his entire life upon had not, in the end, been wrong about absolutely everything. So he came, and the small party set out together into the transformed and silent world, breaking their slow way up the mountain through snow that lay waist deep in the open places and far, far deeper in the hollows and the gullies. It was a brutal climb. It took them the better part of a full day to fight their way up into the high country, a day of breaking trail through unbroken white, of hauling one another bodily out of drifts, of breath steaming and freezing in their beards, of lungs that burned with every gasp of the thin and bitter air. And when at long last they crested the final rise, and looked down upon the place where the burned house had once stood, every heart among them sank, because there was nothing there. The entire site lay beneath a smooth, perfect, uninterrupted blanket of white, featureless, gleaming, a grave fit for a queen, and just as silent as one. The lone chimney, the dark landmark that Amos had remembered, the black stone finger that had pointed at the sky, was very nearly buried whole. Only its uppermost tip showed above the snow now, a single dark point, lost in all that endless, blinding white. The ruin was gone. And the girl, surely, was gone along with it, entombed somewhere far beneath all those countless tons of patient, smothering, merciless white. Amos felt a sharp, cold blade of grief slide clean through his chest. He took off his hat slowly and held it crushed in his weathered hands, and he bowed his old gray head. And beside him, the man named Vance looked down upon that smooth white grave and felt a hollow, joyless, sickening thing that he tried very hard and entirely failed to call vindication. "Told her," Vance muttered. His voice came out hoarse and not the least bit triumphant. "Warned her. Warned the little fool to her face. Madness. It was always. It was only ever madness." But even as the word left him, it tasted strange and wrong in his mouth, because Amos had stopped listening to him. Amos was staring down at something out in the white. It made no sense. Amos squinted hard against the blinding glare of the snow, certain his tired old eyes had finally begun to deceive him. But no, there it was, rising up out of a small dark hole in the smooth white surface, up from the very spot where he remembered the top of that second vent shaft to be, the one set higher up the hill. There rose a thin, pale, curling plume, a wisp, a vapor. It rose and it curled, and it melted the snow gently back from the ragged edges of its little hole. And it was warm. He could see, plain as day, that it was warm. In all that frozen and lifeless and silent white, in a place where every living thing should by now have been buried and frozen and long since dead. Something, somewhere down beneath the snow, was breathing out warm air into the morning. And then he saw the other thing, down low, where the buried chimney's base must be, a perfect, round, bare circle of dark, melted earth, as though something below it were giving off a gentle, steady, patient, living heat, as though the very ground itself, in that one impossible spot, were breathing. Amos Hartley's old heart slammed once, hard, against his ribs, and a wild, impossible, half-mad hope rose up through him so fast and so fierce that it very nearly took his legs out from under him where he stood. "No," he breathed to no one. "It can't be. It cannot be." And then he was moving. He half ran and half fell down the slope, floundering and plunging through the deep snow, and he threw himself down at the very spot where he remembered the cellar door to lie. And he began to dig, with his bare hands, with his arms, frantic, gasping, hurling great armfuls of snow up and aside, heedless of the cold biting through to the bone. The other men stared after him a moment, struck dumb, certain the old man's grief had finally cracked his wits. And then Amos's wild and desperate urgency caught hold of them all at once, and they came stumbling and sliding down the slope after him, and they too fell to digging, throwing themselves into it, a silent and frantic and desperate excavation in the very middle of all that endless white. They dug for what felt like hours. The snow was deep, so deep, and packed iron hard in places where the wind had driven it. Their breath tore raw at the freezing air. Their arms went numb to the shoulder. And still they dug, on and on, spurred forward by the old man's cracking voice, and by that small, impossible, curling plume of warm breath still rising faithfully from the white. And then, at last, a man's shovel struck something that was not snow. It struck wood, the top edge of a door, a heavy door of stout planks and packed earth. Amos clawed the last of the snow away from it with his bare and bleeding and frozen hands, and he raised his fist high, and he brought it down upon those planks with every last thing he had left in his old body. "Girl!" he bellowed, and his weathered voice cracked clean down the middle. "Are you down there? Can you hear? Answer, child, can you hear?" And then he went utterly still, and every man around him went still as stone. And together, in the ringing silence, they listened. For a long, long moment, there was nothing at all, only the vast white silence of the buried world, only the sound of their own ragged, steaming breath, only the frantic, hopeful, terrified pounding of one old man's heart. And then, from somewhere down below the snow and the planks and the packed earth, came a sound, a soft, faint, scraping sound, the sound of a heavy wooden bar being lifted slowly, carefully, from the inside. Every man around that hole froze where he knelt. Amos sat back hard on his heels, his fist still raised in the air, his breath caught and locked in his throat. The door shifted. Then it groaned, low, on its frame. And then, slowly and impossibly, and against every law those hard men believed they understood about the world, it swung open into the dark below. And up out of that opening, into the bitter and lifeless and frozen cold of the buried world, there rolled a wave of warm air. Warm, soft, and gentle, and unmistakable, and utterly, impossibly warm, and carrying upon it the homely smell of warm food, and lamp oil, and a place where someone lived, and cooked, and slept, and belonged. And standing there in the open doorway, holding a softly glowing lantern up against the dark behind her, was the girl. She was not frozen. She was not starved. She was not the broken, frost-bitten, lifeless ruin they had climbed a whole mountain through the snow to recover and carry home. She stood there in the warm, golden light of her own home, and her cheeks held the healthy, living flush of a person who had been comfortable and well-fed and warm. Her eyes were clear and steady. Her hands did not shake upon the lantern. She was not even wearing a coat. She stood there in nothing but a simple shirt, in the dead and frozen heart of a winter that had broken roofs and emptied woodpiles and humbled a whole proud valley. And behind her, in the soft golden glow, the men could plainly see the neat shelves heavy with food, the small worn table, the snug and living and breathing warmth of a true and proper home. Not a tomb, a haven. The men stared. Not one of them could find a single word. They stood there in the snow, in the freezing wind, breathing in the impossible warm air that flowed and curled out around her from below. And they looked upon her the way men look upon a thing for which they have no words at all. A ghost, a miracle, a girl who should, by every hard law they had ever known, have been dead and frozen days ago, and who stood instead in her own warm doorway, whole and calm and flushed with life, holding up a light against the dark. And at the very back of the small party, the man named Vance pushed his way forward through the others, his face gone the gray-white color of the snow itself. He stared past her into the warm and golden and living dark behind her, at the food upon the shelves, at the simple comfort of it, at the gentle, breathing, impossible warmth of a place where there was no roaring fire, no great iron stove, no brute and certain strength of the kind he had worshipped and trusted and built his entire life upon. His mouth opened, and the only thing that came out of it was a whisper. A single broken word, torn loose from somewhere deep beneath the rubble of all his old, proud, shattered certainty. How? The word hung in the freezing air between them, small, broken, stripped clean of every ounce of the contempt it had once carried so easily, so carelessly, in a warm room far below. Vance stood at the edge of the dugout doorway, swaying just slightly on his feet. He was staring past Marin into the warm and golden dark of her home, and he could not seem to look away from it. His fine coat was crusted white with snow, his face was the gray color of old ash, and his eyes, those eyes that had once looked down on her from the height of a fine saddle, that had smirked at her across the width of a wide dark desk, those eyes now belonged to a man whose entire world had just come apart in his two cold hands. "There is no fire," he whispered. "There is no stove, no flame, nothing." He shook his head slowly, the way a man shakes his head when he is trying and failing to wake himself from a dream. "It isn't possible. A person cannot be warm here. Not like this. Not in the dead heart of a winter like this one. Not without fire." Marin looked at him for a long, long moment, and the strangest thing happened in her chest then. The strangest and the most unexpected thing of all. She felt no triumph. She had imagined this moment. More than once. In the dark of more than one bitter cold night, curled in the lee of the chimney before she ever found the cellar, she had imagined it. The faces of the men who had cast her out. The exact words she would fling back at them when her hour finally came. The cold and perfect cruelty she would return to them, measure for careful measure. She had earned it. Every last word of it. Anyone would have said so. But now that the hour had truly come, now that she stood here in her own warm doorway, watching this broken man sway in the snow with the ruin of his certainty all over his gray face, all she felt was a quiet, weary kind of pity. His world had been so loud and so certain, and in the end, so very, very small. And it had just been undone, completely and forever, by a single simple truth that he had never once in all his long proud life thought to stop and listen for. There was no satisfaction in watching a man learn a thing that late and that hard. There was only the cold wind and the white silence and a tired sort of sorrow for all the years he had wasted being so sure. So Marin did not say the cruel and perfect words she had once rehearsed. She said something else entirely. "You are mistaken, Mr. Vance," she said, and her voice was clear and steady and carried easily across the vast white hush of the buried world. "There is a fire." He stared at her, uncomprehending. "It is only," she went on quietly, "a very old one, and a very, very slow one." She gestured not at any hearth, for there was none, but at the ground, at the earth itself, at the snow beneath all their feet, and the deep, patient clay beneath that. "This house does not fight the winter," she said. "That was never the way of it. It does not throw fire at the cold, and pray the fire wins." She let the words settle in the silence. "It remembers the summer," she said. "The earth gathers up the warmth of 1,000 summer days, and it holds them deep down in the dark all through the long cold months. And when the winter comes, it breathes that warmth back out again, slowly, gently, the way you would breathe on cold hands to warm them." She looked at him, and there was no cruelty in her face at all, Only the truth. This is no grave at all, Mr. Vance, she said softly. It is a memory of warmth. And the earth here does not bury the living. It keeps them. It was a simple thing to say, simple and quiet, and almost gentle. And it was utterly devastating to the men who had spent their whole lives believing the only answer to the cold was a bigger fire and a thicker wall. They had tried to shout the winter down. They had fed their roaring stoves until the wood ran out, and built their walls thick, and trusted in force, and certainty, and noise. And the winter had broken them anyway, broken their roofs, and emptied their woodpiles, and humbled them down to the bone. And this girl, this discarded, dismissed, condemned girl, had simply listened to a whisper, and she had thrived. The men stood in the snow and the warm rising air, and not one of them had a single word to say. Maren stepped back from the doorway, and then she did the thing that none of them, not one, had expected her to do. She opened her home to them. "Come in," she said, "all of you, before the cold takes your fingers off. Come down out of it and get warm." They hesitated. Of course they did. These were hard men, proud men, in their own weathered and silent way. They had climbed a whole mountain through waist-deep snow, expecting to dig out a frozen body. And instead, they had walked straight into a living miracle. And a miracle is a difficult thing for a hard man to simply walk down into. But the cold was real. And the warm air curling up out of that dark doorway was realer still. So, one by one, they came, down the worn stone steps into the soft golden light, and one by one, as they reached the bottom, they stopped, and they stared, and they fell completely silent, because it was warm, truly, deeply, impossibly warm. A soft and even and living warmth that wrapped itself around their frozen bodies and seeped down into their aching bones, with no fire anywhere to be found. They looked at the shelves, heavy and groaning with food, at the jars glowing like a king's jewels in the steady lamplight, at the small, neat table, the simple, worn stool, the leather journal lying open upon it, like a held breath. They had come up this mountain to bury a foolish girl, and they had found instead the warmest and the safest and the most alive place in all that frozen and broken and humbled world. Maren moved among them quietly, the way a person moves among guests they have waited a long time to welcome. She ladled warm food from the pot on her little spirit stove, and she pressed it into their cupped and half-frozen hands. She gave them water that was not ice. She gave them, for 1 hour, a place out of the killing cold. And as she did, something happened in that small, warm cellar that none of the men ever quite found the words to speak of. Then, or in all the years after, they began to thaw. And not just their stiff hands and their wind-burned faces. Something deeper than that. They had carried the certainty of the valley all the way up the mountain on their backs. The certainty that this girl was a fool, that her great-grandmother had been mad, that the burned place was a curse and a grave, and nothing more, nothing more. World without end, and there in the warmth of her home, with her food warming their bellies and her kindness shaming their hearts, that certainty melted off of them, quietly, completely, like the snow melting from their heavy coats and pooling on her clean-swept floor. Old Amos Hartley sat apart on an overturned crate, a bowl of warm beans cradled in his two weathered hands, and he could not stop the slow tears that tracked down through the deep canyons of his old face. He had given her a shovel and a blanket, and a few small tins of lamp oil, and he had ridden back down this mountain believing, in his heart, that he had handed a frightened child the tools to dig her own grave, and then turned his back and left her to it. And she had taken that shovel, and she had built this warm and living and impossible thing in the one place on all the earth where he had been most certain that nothing and no one could ever live. The old voice came out of him thick and broken. "Forgive me, girl. You should never have been left up here alone. You should have been carried down off this mountain by force, if it came to that." He shook his gray head. There was such certainty in it, such terrible, foolish certainty. "You came back," Marin said gently. She crossed to him, and she rested one work-hardened hand on his shaking old shoulder. "You came back, Mr. Hartley. Twice, when no one else came at all. You brought the lantern that has lit every night of this winter. You brought the blanket that kept the cold off." She pressed his shoulder just once. "That is the part that matters, not the doubting, the coming back." And the old man bowed his gray head down over his bowl of warm beans, and he could not say another single word. But something in him that day was made whole again. A guilt he might have carried to his grave, set down at last in the warm dark of her home. It was Vance who lingered the longest, and Vance who could not bring himself to eat. He sat apart from the others on the very bottom of the stone steps, and the warmth he had sworn was impossible soaked slowly into him whether he willed it or not, and his eyes kept drifting again and again back to the worn leather journal lying open upon the little table. At last he reached out, and with one trembling finger he turned it toward himself, and he read the words written there in that strong and beautiful and long dead hand. "Listen to the earth, not the shout." And something in his gray and ruined face broke open. His finger rested on the page, and then, haltingly, the rest of it came out of him. The story of a father who had known the woman who wrote this book, Cora. A father who had told that story his whole life long, how she had shamed him, made a fool of him before the whole valley, with her riddles and her strange notions, and her endless talk of the wisdom of the earth. A shame he had carried to his grave, and handed down like something precious. She wasn't shaming him, Vance whispered. Was she? She was trying to teach him, and he was too proud to hear a word of it. His voice cracked. Too proud. The way the proud always are. The way it was always easier to call her mad, to call you mad, than to stand here and admit there was anything left in all this world a proud man did not already know. Marin said nothing. There was nothing she needed to say. The truth was doing its own slow, quiet, devastating work inside him now. And the truth, she had learned long ago, never once needed her help to do it. Vance rose at last on unsteady legs. He looked around the warm cellar one final time, at the laden shelves, at the steady lamp, at the gentle breathing grate in the floor, at the girl he had condemned to a freezing death, who had instead, with her own two hands, set warm food before him without a single word of reproach. "You are owed an apology," he said quietly, "a far larger one than words could ever carry. And it would be an insult to pretend that a handful of them could ever settle it." He moved toward the steps, and then he stopped. "What you have built here," he said, not quite able to look at her, "the whole valley needs it. They are freezing down there. Right now, as we stand here warm, roofs fallen in, wood piles burned down to bare ground. Good people who trusted in big fires and thick walls, the way the whole valley did, the way a proud fool did." He drew a long, shaking breath. If there is anything in that book of hers that could help them, they need it more than they have ever needed anything in their lives. And then he climbed the worn stone steps, and he went out into the cold, a smaller and a quieter, and a far more human man than the one who had ridden so proudly up that mountain at dawn. He did not stay in the valley a great while longer after that winter. But the man who eventually packed his things and went was not the same man who had once handed a frightened orphan a cruel joke and a cold iron key. Something in him had been humbled that day in the warm dark, past all hope of repair, and humbled, perhaps, though no one could ever say for certain, into something a little better than he had been. He never spoke an unkind word about the burned place or its strange young keeper again. And once, before he left, he was seen leaving a quiet stack of good split firewood at the door of a widow who had lost her roof in the storm, and saying nothing of it to anyone. Whether that was true redemption, or only the long silence of a pride that had finally been broken, Maren never knew for certain. She decided in the end that it did not greatly matter which. Some doors a person can only open. It is for others to decide whether they will walk through them. The winter loosened its grip slowly, the way that winters always do. The great white ocean that had buried the whole world began, week by patient week, to draw back. First to gray and rotting slush in the low valleys, then to bare wet earth, and then, at last, to the first impossible tender green of a high country spring. And as the snow drew back, the people began to come up the mountain, but they did not come the way they once would have come. They did not come with pity in their faces. They did not come with smirks, or with charity, or to escort a foolish girl back down to a life she had refused. They came with questions. They came because they had heard the story now. The story of the girl who had lived, warm and whole and unafraid, all the way through the very storm that had broken the rest of them. The tale had spread through the valley in the long weeks of the thaw, not as a scandal any longer, but as a wonder, a quiet, astonishing, almost unbelievable wonder. And they wanted, more than anything, to understand it. How does a house stay warm with no fire burning in it? How does the cold earth hold the memory of a summer? And how on this earth does a person learn to listen for a whisper, when the whole loud world has spent their entire life teaching them only how to shout? Maren did not turn a single one of them away. She had spent her whole life being turned away. She knew, better than anyone living, exactly what it did to a person to stand at a locked gate in the cold and be told there was no place inside for the likes of them. She would not do that to another living soul. Not ever. Not for any reason in the world. So she opened the journal, and she shared it, freely and patiently and gladly. and without asking a single thing in return. She showed them Cora's elegant diagrams. She explained the deep, heat-holding clay and the two breathing shafts and the slow, patient battery of the warming earth. She walked them through all of it in plain and simple words until the strange and the impossible became, at last, merely clever, sensible, a thing that a person could build with their own two hands and a strong back, if only they were willing to dig deep enough, and to listen close enough, and to trust the quiet thing over the loud one. And in the long, warm months of that first spring and summer, with the help of old Amos Hartley and a dozen others who came now, not as doubters, but as friends, she rebuilt the house at last above the cellar. But she did not build it the way the valley had always built its houses. She built it the way Cora had drawn it, all those years before. The house above and the breathing heart below joined together into one single living thing. She built a great masonry hearth at the center of it, a vast stone keeper of warmth that could hold the heat of one small, careful fire, and give it back, slow and gentle, for a whole day and a whole night. The house that did not fight the winter. The house that remembered the summer. People came from far beyond the valley to see it, and Maren, the orphan, the outcast, the girl the whole world had once folded its hands over and quietly decided was no one's concern at all, became, without ever quite meaning to, a teacher. She taught them how to raise homes that kept their own warmth close, how to set a house to face the sun and the wind instead of standing blind against them, how to dig a cellar that was not a cold dead hole in the ground, but a living, breathing pantry, a heart. And she taught them, above all of it, the one great thing that Cora had spent a whole quiet lifetime trying to say, that the loudest voice in any room is very rarely the wisest one in it, that true strength is not always the kind that shouts and breaks and burns bright and fast and devours everything around it, that sometimes, often, the deepest strength of all is the quiet kind, the patient kind, the kind that listens and remembers and keeps faith through the longest and darkest of nights, and simply waits. The valley changed slowly in the years that came after. The homes grew warmer, the winters grew a little less fearsome, the people grew steadier in themselves, and gentler with one another, and a little more willing, just a little, to stop, and to be still, and to listen for the quiet things they had once been far too loud to hear. It was not a loud change. It did not arrive all at once, in a single bright moment. But the best changes, Maren had long since come to understand, almost never do. And what became of Maren herself, that was the part of the story the valley told the least, because it was the quietest part of all. And the quietest things are always the very hardest to put into plain words. But the truth was this. The girl who had once knelt in the cold ashes, hollowed out and emptied, and ready to lie down, and let the winter simply take her, had healed. Not all at once, not the clean and tidy way a wound heals over in a tale, but slowly, the way the deep snow had drawn back from the mountain, week by week and season by season, until one ordinary day she looked up from her work and found that the cold, hard thing inside her chest, the thing that had first sparked to life beside one small purple flower in the ash, had quietly, somewhere along the way, become something else entirely. It had become warmth, real warmth, the kind that does not have to be guarded or earned or proven over and over again to anyone who doubts it. She had come up to the burned place with nothing at all. No family, no home, no single soul in all the wide cold world who would have come looking for her if that first storm had quietly taken her in the dark. And she had found in the end that she had been wrong about that. Wonderfully, completely wrong. She had found Amos, who sat at her great stone hearth on long winter evenings now, and told his slow, rambling stories, and laughed his rusty old laugh, and had become, somewhere in the years, something very much like the family she had never had. She had found the dozens who had come, and stayed, and dug, and built, who had become neighbors, and then become friends, and then become something warmer and deeper than either of those words could hold. She had found a whole valley that had once turned its back on her line, and had turned, at the last, all the way around to face it. She had found, after a whole lifetime of locked gates, a home, not the cellar, not the house above it. Those were only ever stone and earth and timber and clever work. The home was the warmth, and the warmth, she had finally learned, had never once been about the fire at all. There came an evening, many quiet years on, when Marin sat alone at the great stone hearth as the dark came gently down outside. She was no longer young. The hard labor of those first brutal winters, and all the gentler years that had followed them, had marked her kindly, silvered her hair, deepened the lines around her eyes, and settled a deep and easy calm down into her bones, like warmth settling into clay. Outside, the first snow of yet another winter had begun to fall, soft this time, slow, drifting down feather by feather, nothing at all like the great roaring white fury that had once buried the whole of the world. She did not fear it anymore. She had not feared a winter in a very long time. The house breathed warm around her, the way it always had, and the way it always would. The long, patient memory of 100 gathered summers rising up gently out of the earth to hold the dark and the cold politely at the door. And there, open on her knees, lay the journal, Cora's journal, soft now with all the years of her own handling, and thicker, far thicker than it had been on the night she first found it in the dark, because Marin had added to it, page after page after page, in her own steady hand, a hand that had grown, over the long years, nearly as strong and as sure as the one that had filled those first beloved pages. She had written down everything, every secret of the warming earth, every lesson the mountain had taught her, slowly and patiently, and sometimes cruelly, across all those years, so that none of it would ever be lost again, so that the whisper would always have someone left to pass itself along to, when she herself was finally gone. She dipped her pen that quiet snowfall evening, and she turned to a fresh and empty page, and she sat for a long while, just listening to the soft hush of the snow and the deep silence of the mountain and the gentle, faithful breathing of the house all around her. And then, slowly, she began to write, not instructions this time, not diagrams or measurements or the careful science of the breathing earth. Those were already there, in their patient hundreds. She wrote something simpler than all of that. She wrote it for whoever might come after her, for some lost and frozen soul who might one day, in some winter still to come, stumble up this same hard mountain, clutching nothing but a cold key and the broken pieces of a life, and find their way down into the warm dark, and open this old book and read. She wrote, "They will tell you that you are nothing, that you have nothing, that you are too small and too late and too alone to ever matter to anyone at all. Do not believe them. The world threw this place away once and called it a grave, but the earth never threw it away, not for a single day. The earth was only waiting, keeping the warmth, keeping the faith, holding 100 summers safe in its quiet, patient heart, for whoever might one day come along with the wit and the need and the plain stubbornness to stop and to listen. So if you are reading this, in the cold and the dark, with nothing left in your two hands, then listen now. You were not cast out of the world. You are a part of it. You always were. You always will be. And the warmth you have been searching for your whole life long is already here, right here, beneath your own 2 feet, waiting. It has been waiting for you all along. All you have to do, child, is be still enough, and quiet enough, and brave enough to feel it." She set down the pen, and she sat there a long while in the warm and golden quiet, an old woman in a house that remembered the summer, while the soft snow fell and harmed no living thing at all. She had been given a grave, and she had made of it a home. That was all. And it was everything. Outside, the cold pressed gently against the windows, the way it always had, and the way it always would. And inside, the house breathed warm. A girl who had once been utterly alone was alone no longer. A warmth that had been hidden away in the dark had been found and shared and given freely to all who came, and a whisper that had so very nearly been lost forever, in the ashes and the cold and the long indifferent dark, had, at the last, been heard.